Welcome back to Special Ed on Special Ed. I'm your host, Dana Jonson, and I'm excited for today's episode. We have Dr. Tamara Soles, who's a psychologist, a parent coach, and founder of the Secure Child Center for Families and Children. She's also the mom of twins who present everyday opportunities to live what she's practiced with families for almost 20 years. That harnessing the power of connection helps children thrive. Dr. Tamara created No More Power Struggles, a positive parenting course using brain-based and attachment-focused strategies. You can find free parenting resources, which is at her website, which we'll discuss later, and I will also put in my show notes. So if you're in the car driving and at the end of this, you're like, I got to find Dr. Tamara, then please go to the show notes and all of her contact information will be there. So thank you so much for joining me.
It is my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Dana.
Great. Before we get started, I have to play my disclaimer because, I'm a lawyer, so I do this. So everyone listen, and we'll be right back.
The information in this podcast is provided for general informational and entertainment purposes only and may not reflect the current law in your jurisdiction at the time you're listening. Nothing in this episode creates an attorney-client relationship, nor is it legal advice. Do not act or refrain from acting on the basis of any information included in or accessible through this episode without seeking appropriate legal or other professional advice on the particular facts and circumstances at issue from a lawyer or service provider licensed in your state, country, or other appropriate licensing jurisdiction.
So, Dr. Tamara, I have some questions. I have lots of questions. I have 5 kids, so I've got tons of questions for you. But I will try to keep us on track. It's funny. Most of them are older. Next year, I'm going to have 4 kids in college, and I still feel like I'm parenting. It's still...
Yes, it never ends.
I was also very interested in your area of expertise because 3 of my children are adopted through foster care. So, we did have a lot of interesting challenges as parents that I don't think are the typical ones. But so a lot of your work really resonated with me. Let's start by some background. I'd love to know, how did you get to here? How did you decide that this was going to be your focus? And what was your journey?
I always knew I wanted to work with children, and I just didn't know in what capacity. But from a very young age, I wanted to advocate for kids in some way. I wanted to sort of be a voice that I felt like I had even as a young, perhaps a little mouthy at times kid and outspoken. And I felt like kids needed more advocates. And so trying to find my path along my educational journey, I really felt connected to psychology, but particularly to early childhood mental health. And I knew that that was a time period that was so precious and was afforded a lot of leeway in terms of how we can shape children's brains, how we can start to shift some trajectories. And so when I went through graduate school and then on to my internship, I interned at the Children's Hospital of Los Angeles and did a specialty in early childhood mental health and knew right away I was in the right place. It was this relationship-based focus. I was starting to learn more about the neuroscience related to development, and not just when does a child do what, but why and how do we help a child develop in a way that allows them to thrive. And it was very different than what many of us were exposed to culturally in terms of how children are parented. And so that drew me in, and I just loved the idea of empowering parents and kids together to reconnect in that way and build really strong bonds while helping their development thrive. So for me, it was just right fit in terms of sitting in that relationship with families.
Oh, that's wonderful. As an undergraduate, I was a psychology major and I loved early development. That was I just absolutely loved it. I did not go into psychology in any way, but I really thrived on that. And part of that was because what I was learning at that time was so vastly different from how I was raised.
Right? Yes,
we had there was a slightly different philosophy going on in the 70s when I was raised. And, it was more of a fend for yourself kind of thing. But yes. it is. And it's interesting. And I've over time and with my children been able to see that sort of, we went from, none of it to all of it to trying to find the balance somewhere in there, because it can be done incorrectly. Right? I think there can be that overcompensation piece as well.
Yes, 100%.
Where are you now? Tell us where you are right now.
quite literally, I'm in Montreal. And that's where I founded a center for families and children where our focus really is everything from helping parents navigate the very typical but nonetheless challenging aspects of parenthood, whether it's sleep challenges or meltdowns, all the way to doing assessments for various developmental conditions, autism, ADHD, learning differences, and supporting those children in getting the accommodations or supports that they need, advocating for them in schools. So I run a clinic. We have a team of psychologists that do assessment and therapy. And I also do a lot of writing and podcasting for other therapists. So right now I'm at a stage of my career that I'm really loving, in the sense that I have diversified the different ways that I can impact families. And I just love being able to have that diversity, especially at this stage of my life, as I'm a parent of twins, as you mentioned. And, at the stage that they're at, I love having this kind of flexibility to be at their school one day and then see clients another day and then do a podcast another day. So I'm wonderful. Very, very fortunate. Yes.
And I think also, this world of podcasting is just another vessel for us to provide information to parents, and
Exactly.
It's so wonderful. I think that's why I started this, was for parents of children with disabilities. There are so many resources out there, and it can be overwhelming. That if you find a voice that you enjoy, or a person that you like to follow, it does make it a little easier. And there's so much good information that you can get from podcasting. And it's funny because I want to say it might have been my mother. Someone had said, well, I would never listen to a podcast. I'm like, well, you're not my demographic.
Right.
That ship has sailed. I want to talk a little bit about what attachment in parenting is. And if you can break that down into some language that those of us who are not doctors can understand,
yes.
Be wonderful.
Yes. Absolutely. And I like to differentiate between what I call capital A attachment parenting and just attachment itself. And I think for a lot of people, if they do have any exposure to the term attachment parenting, it connotes a very specific meaning for them. So they might think about bed sharing, breastfeeding, baby wearing, the very specific components of so-called attachment parenting. And I think that's where we've maybe gone wrong in some ways, because it has been presented as the only way to attach to your baby. And while all of those things are wonderful vehicles for attachment, they are by no means the only vehicle. But really, when it comes down to it, attachment is really being attuned to our children, meaning that we're able to read their cues and signals as often as we can, and we don't get it right 100% of the time, and that's okay. We don't need to. But it's really being tuned into our children and responsive to our children in a way that helps them feel safe and connected. So really, that's what it is. So it doesn't matter whether you co-sleep or they're in their own crib or they're in their own rooms, you breastfeed, bottle feed, whatever. As long as we can do whatever we do with the intention of connection and responsiveness, that is attachment. And so when a child is securely attached to us, it means that they feel safe to explore the world and know that they have this calm, safe home base to return to when they need to. So it gives them that freedom and flexibility, which is also counterintuitive for a lot of people, because
that's what I was just thinking that. Yes.
Yes. Because they think about attachment as sometimes kids are too stuck to their parent, when in reality, that secure attachment allows independence and allows that flourishing away from the parent. And then we can return back to connection.
Yes. And I've heard that over the years, parenting many children in many different ways, that piece of are you doing too much for them? Or are they too secure? If you have them sleep in your bed, they'll never, ever leave, which, by the way, they do on their own eventually when they're ready, just so in case anyone wants to know. I had one child who did themselves stay in our bed for a long time. And, I remember hearing that, well, it's never going to change. And you know what it did? Yeah, when they were ready, exactly. They left, and it was normal and appropriate and all that other stuff. And then there are people who say, look, I can't even sleep if the kids are in my bed. Then you don't have to. If that's going to make your night a nightmare, then that doesn't have to happen. there are other ways. I have so many follow-up questions. I'm trying to narrow myself down. But where do we, because we've talked now a little bit about where did that shift happen from fend for yourself, you're on your own from the beginning, to I want to develop that attachment and I want to do these things. And I think some of those misconceptions come from prior generations telling us you're too nice to them. You're attached too much to them. You know, those pieces that we hear. How did we make that shift? Because this is my suspicion, I don't know, but those who really didn't respond to that type of parenting are the ones who jumped on board first, right? For those for whom they felt like it didn't matter, toughened them up, whatever, may have felt that was a positive way to parent moving forward. I do think that we're seeing a lot more repercussions of that from children now, and that might be because there are so many other safe spaces, and that hasn't always been the case. But how did we as a society start to make that transition?
I think you're right when you described this pendulum swing earlier, right? Where in 100 years, we've gone from children really not having their own sort of identity and rights as children per se, all the way to them being these precious things that we hold up on a pedestal and are so fragile that we can't do anything to harm them in any way. And now we're finding more of a balance. And, should I be so lucky to see where we're at in parenting in 40 years, that will be exciting and interesting too.
Yes.
But I think there's many things that have occurred, one of which is the reaction that many of us had to growing up in certain environments and realizing that didn't work, right? And that a lot of people are feeling very anxious, very insecure, lacking in self-confidence, not really knowing how to move through this world in a way that feels calm and collected. And this notion of regulating our own emotions is such a tricky one for so many. And so I think that even though culturally parents started to move toward the idea of children being very important and needing that connection with parents, there still lacked this notion of regulation that just wasn't in the culture at the time. And we see it everywhere. We see it in people who struggle with feeling anything uncomfortable. And so they manage that discomfort through shopping, through dating, through other dangerous or maladaptive strategies, right? But what also happened sort of simultaneously was a lot of research into child development. And in particular, Dan Siegel, who you may be familiar with, who I was very lucky to actually have been in LA for my internship and then postdoc in 2000-ish, when Dan Siegel was really starting to talk about this notion of interpersonal neurobiology. And that term, interpersonal neurobiology, sounds very fancy and complicated, when really it just means that brains develop in a context of relationship, right? So a parent and a child together, their brains develop and grow. And when Dr. Siegel started talking more about his research, we started to understand just how important the relationship was. And we knew about attachment from early attachment researchers, Bowlby's research, Ainsworth's research, but really understanding how it connects to self-regulation, for example, and how we manage our emotions and why that matters in terms of development and parenting, and how parents manage their own emotions. That has become the biggest shift I've seen. So I left Montreal around, I think, 2000-ish. And when I left, as opposed to when I returned in 2010, the shift was almost unbelievable in terms of how much things had changed, and in terms of how people understood child development and what child psychologists were doing. And when I returned, there was still a lot of psychologists really stuck in this behavioral model of parenting. So that behavioral model has persisted for many, many, many years, this notion of reward, punishment, consequence. And certainly there are many still entrenched in that framework. But in large part because of people like Dan Siegel's work, we're starting to understand why that has its limits and why it can be ineffective for many children and potentially even harmful for some, particularly neurodivergent children. I know we'll talk more about neurodivergent children as well. But being able to see, oh, we need to understand how the brain wires and in the context of relationship so that we can understand how to help people develop these regulation skills to be able to navigate uncomfortable emotions and to be able to understand that our goal as parents isn't to reward or punish a behavior, but to problem solve and to work through big feelings and try to come up with the solution for what's underneath. So it's just, I think, this constellation of changes in terms of generationally, as well as from this scientific perspective of the things that we're learning about how children develop and grow.
Yes. And I think that as parents too, you were saying this, there was an idea that as an adult and as a parent, if things weren't going well, it was because you didn't make good choices, as opposed to this is how you learned to manage your emotions. And this is how you learned to have a relationship. And this is what you learned was the way you make choices. And those were all learned things that we were not connecting to a childhood. And I think it can be very freeing to recognize that, as you're saying, for parents themselves, understanding how they process their emotions and how that impacts their children, having that understanding for yourself and recognizing that it's okay. Like it's okay if you don't rocket this right out of the gate,
I still don't rocket it some days. Many days.
I mean, every time I think I'm crushing it, something comes and bashes me in the head with it. But, and understanding that's okay. And if you have a bad day as a parent, you really messed up, that instead of clinging to, well, I was right just because, even just explaining that with your child and having that conversation of that was not okay, or, I made a mistake, it teaches them how to accept mistakes. I find it fascinating when we say, we expect children to apologize, yet we refuse to do that to them. We're not giving them an example. And the double-edged sword, which can be confusing for a lot of children. One of my favorite stories is my nephew. We were sitting at the table with my mother and all the cousins are around. He's really little. And he was saying something, telling a story. And my mother turned around and said, okay, well, what were you saying? He's like, I'm sorry, you weren't listening. You don't get to hear it. And everyone got so angry at him. He's like, well, that's what Mrs. So-and-so says. And he was telling them what his teacher had told him. If you're not listening, you don't get to hear it. And so, it was hilarious. I couldn't stop laughing. I thought it was funny. And not all the adults in the room thought it was as funny as I did.
I'm sure not.
But, we don't recognize that, in one environment, we're saying you have to do exactly what the teacher says, right? Because that's what's right. And then we put you in another environment and that's not how you're supposed to behave. And then we're going to put you in another environment and there's a whole different set of rules. And that's very confusing for children. So how do you... you're talking a little about problem solving with the child, but how do you account for that? Because you're not the only adult in their lives, right? So there are different rules in different areas. How does that factor in to the attachment parenting model?
That's a great question. And I think it's a concern a lot of parents have as they release their child into the world in whatever environment that is. And it's what is going to happen when this person doesn't interact with them the same way that I do. And especially for parents who hopefully are making very intentional choices with their children and then realize that their child is going to enter a world where everyone's not on the same page necessarily.
Yes.
And as much as we try as parents to make choices that are aligned with our values as much as possible. So for example, for me with my children, I chose a school and had the luxury, thankfully, of choosing a school that very much aligned with our values and how we view education and discipline, so-called discipline. But not everybody is in that same position. And so just knowing that having one strong attachment figure in your life is a major buffer. So even though a child is going to butt up against somebody who's not going to co-regulate with them, who's not going to validate their feelings, who's not going to help them problem solve and is simply going to tell them to be quiet or, admonish them in some way, that's okay in the sense that they have the protection of that secure attachment to help them navigate that. And hopefully, over time, we foster open communication with our children so that they can come home and say, hey, this happened with this person today. And we can listen to them as parents, and then we can talk about it together and say, do you think this is something that we need to do something about? Or is this something that we just kind of sit together and be like, man, that sucked? Or is this a conversation that we have to, have with somebody? And then because we are so practiced at problem solving with them, it helps them to know, oh, I can go home and problem solve with my parent about what to do about this situation. And a little anecdote that's coming to my mind was just yesterday. So my children are 10, and my daughter was playing with a neighbor, and there was a bit of a conflict over Lego, a common
naturally
10-year-old conflict. And as I was sitting there trying to facilitate this conflict, my daughter said to the neighbor, she said, don't worry, each of us is going to be able to have our say, and then we'll solve it together. And it just warmed my heart because, yes, it was so cute. But what gave me such confidence from that and comfort was that she knew the process. She knew that when these things happen, we sit down and I listen to both sides. They have to not interrupt each other. Sometimes they need the reminder. And then we problem solve together. And so the fact that she knew that is what gives me comfort. And so coming back to what happens when we send our children out to the world, that's what we rely on. We rely on the fact that our relationship and the things that we create with our children will help buffer them and empower them in various situations. And sometimes those things will be benign, not ideal moments with others, and some will be more substantial and will require some sort of intervention. But as long as they know that they have that backup, that person, that safe base to go back to, then we can help them navigate those challenges, whether it's friends, whether it's teachers, coaches, you name it, another parent, right? Another friend's parent, for example.
Yeah, no, that's great because I do, and I have encountered parents who expect the environment to shift for however they are parenting, and that's not feasible. It's just not realistic. And, trying to avoid those conflicts for their child or make all those conflicts better is also not realistic.
No,
so,
and not helpful sometimes either.
Yeah, not helpful.
Right? Yeah.
In the grand scheme of things.
Yeah.
And I think I just think it's so interesting that having that attachment, it's not about, and I think that is where our heads go, right? If it's attachment, it's mom doing everything for the kid. Right. And that's not really what it is. It's giving them the confidence, because if they have the confidence at home, they'll have it when they go into the world.
That's right. That's right.
And the problem solving is, that is so critical because I'm not convinced that they learn problem solving anywhere else anymore.
Yes, that's sadly the case in many environments. And really that's what it is. And many parents fall prey to what sounds like a very Canadian term, but snowplow parenting, where they're sort of intent on clearing the road for their child of any obstacle, any bump along the way. And ultimately, as well-intentioned as that is, it really does a disservice to their child because it doesn't allow them the opportunity to navigate those bumps, right? We don't want children to, of course, none of us wants our child to face immense hardship, but many small and sometimes large hardships come along the path regardless. And we need to equip them with the tools to problem solve, to be able to navigate those. So if we remove all of them, then we're not helping them to learn how to go about solving those problems.
And sending them out to manage those problems by themselves without any understanding or training or feeling like they can even come to you and talk to you about them. Because if kids are afraid of getting in trouble for whatever reason, they're simply not going to say anything.
Exactly.
because I obviously deal with a lot of parents, I also find it funny when I hear from parents sometimes, oh, they never lie. And I have to say, my children share more with me than I would like sometimes. I mean, I know that's a good thing, and I have to remind myself sometimes. Yeah. But they all lie at some point. It doesn't mean they're liars, but they keep things to themselves for whatever reason. And I also think, when we go into parenting, we have to recognize that, no, there is no perfect child. There is no child who doesn't lie. I have one child who is almost incapable of lying to your face, but that doesn't mean she shares everything. Do you know what I mean? It doesn't mean I know everything that needs to be known. So I think, it's really important, even if you understand, even if you have one of those relationships with your child that is trusting and safe, that we recognize that we also are never going to know everything. So it's even more important to make sure they have the tools to navigate situations that they are going to navigate on their own, whether we like it or not.
Yes, absolutely. And the example that I often bring up with parents is teenagers when their parents go away for the weekend, right? A common teenage trope. And research has shown us that kids and teens who are raised with this reward punishment model are more likely to do the risky or inappropriate behavior if they perceive the consequence to be absent, meaning that if they think they can get away with it, they're more likely to do it. But children who are parented more from a problem-solving standpoint and more from the use of a moral compass to guide their choices are more likely to try to use their own moral compass in the absence of a threat of punishment. So what does that mean? When the parents go away for the weekend, the child who is generally parented by rewards or consequences is more likely to have that party than the other. Is it possible for both? Of course.
Absolutely.
Right?
But
because teens are going to trip on their own development also, because that's developmentally appropriate. But if we just keep in mind that, exactly as you were saying, we are trying to parent not for the times that they're with us as much as all the rest of their lives, right? It's the long game. So we want them to be able to make choices based on what their values are, what our values are, what feels morally right and wrong. And of course, like us as adults, they're going to mess up sometimes. But when we can bring ourselves back to alignment with our values, we can move forward. And when we do that without shame, and overwhelm from guilt and shame, we're going to be more productive. So if we can equip our children with this ability to problem solve and to consider their values, consider our family values and that moral compass, we're going to position them much better when they're away from us, for sure.
Yeah, no, that is interesting. I know my brother and I would have thrown a party if my parents went to get the mail. I mean, it's just, we were those kids, and it is interesting because what kids do now to rebel sometimes is just totally different, in that, it's not so, well, at least my experience has been, it's more like they won't walk the dogs or clean up after they, stuff like that ends up not getting done. But no, I do hear what you're saying. It is an interesting, as you said, somewhat counterintuitive.
Yeah.
Right? Because you would expect the child, or I would expect the child who feels like their parents aren't going to yell at them would be more likely to do that because they know there'd be less of a consequence, where in reality, that's just not how it plays out. Right. And, I hear that a lot about consequences. And sometimes I hear that from school staff. Well, they need more consequences at home. And you can't give a consequence to something that's out of a child's hands. If it's not, if they're not capable of it. You mentioned a little bit about the interpersonal neurobiology and that both the parent and the child are kind of growing together. Can you speak a little bit more to that? Can you explain that a little better?
Yes. So from the child's perspective, right, children are born with essentially all these neurons that they're going to have for the rest of their lives, essentially, more or less. And it's really about how they wire together, how they connect. And they connect through experience primarily, obviously our genetics, and experience. So the more that somebody experiences something, the more those connections are going to be made. And so when we respond to our child with empathy, right, we're we're helping that pathway develop. When we rehearse with our child how to handle big feelings, then that pathway gets built and strengthened so that over time they get better at managing big feelings. But it really does impact the parent as well, right? For many of us, I would say most of us, were probably not parented in the same way that we're trying to parent our children. And it really does take a lot of self-reflection and self-compassion to be able to parent a child in this attuned way. And our own inner children are going to come up often, right? So, for example, our child might do something that invokes a very strong response from us, and our instinct might be to yell or to shut it down. And sometimes that's coming from a place of our own childhood experiences in which that behavior wouldn't have been tolerated if we had done it, and sometimes might have even been dangerous for us to show. And so our bodies and brains have said, like, shut that down. That's not safe. And so when we're confronted with that as parents, sometimes that's our immediate reaction. And so it takes some self-reflection, some compassion and curiosity to be able
sometimes some therapy,
sometimes just some space, away to be able to really start to recognize when that comes up for us. And that really does shape our brains. We know that our brains do keep evolving and changing. They don't just stop developing and changing after adolescence, which at one point in time we thought was true. But our own wiring is changing in response to being a parent. So that's really this interpersonal neurobiology idea, is that, interpersonal, meaning between us and the child, this relationship, it's the relationship that is evolving and it's changing both of our brains as a result.
That's fascinating.
And it is fascinating. I just love it. It's endlessly fascinating.
Well, and I think, and this is an interesting side of it too, is that if you're invoking that consequence reward and it's not working, I would imagine that turns you to think you're unsuccessful. They don't respect you, right?
Yes.
So that then would impact you that way, which is a completely opposite way to go. So it would make sense then, the converse, that if it is working, and watching your child utilize these skills reinforces your need to use them as well. So it does make sense when you think it through, but I think on its face, it seems a little counterintuitive, as you're saying at the beginning, it's all a little counterintuitive, but the more we learn about children's brains and how they develop and what stages they are at, and as much as, what can they learn right now? Sometimes there are parenting strategies we have that aren't age appropriate and we don't know
100%.
that.
That's right.
Yeah. So how does a parent, as a parent, they don't make you go take child development classes.
No.
And, I know that there's always something I remember reading a parenting book. I like to read. I like to learn. Whether I agree with it or not, I like to learn. And somebody told me that I was never going to sleep again after I had children when I was pregnant. Actually, a lot of people said that when I was pregnant. And I was terrified. So I read like 8 books on reading disorders, and my child slept through the night in 9 weeks. I don't know if it's because I read all these books or she just came that way. But, I'm always reading because I always want to know more. As I was reading a parenting book, I was waiting at ballet or something, and one of the parents turned to me and said, I said, "Oh, this is really interesting. Maybe you should read it." And they're like, "I don't need parenting books." And I was thinking, really? But how do parents identify when they're looking at books? Because sometimes they're just fads. Sometimes they're not based in any kind of science or reality. How do you determine which books you should be following? Do you know what I mean?
Yes, that is a great question. And I don't think anyone's ever asked me that question before. So really, a really wonderful question. I used to joke that parents will just keep reading half of a parenting book, from 10 different parenting books until they find the one that tells them the thing they're already doing. And then
which is totally true, by the way. I think that's 100% true. I absolutely believe that to a degree. There are very few parents who want to read every book all the way through.
Yes. There are a couple of things that are coming to my mind. And so number one is one you already mentioned, something that is actually based in science and research that isn't just somebody's opinion or just somebody's experience. Those are valid, right? And there's a lot of wonderful parenting books that are based on one's experience. But in terms of trying to choose how to guide your own parenting, I think one based and rooted in science is helpful. So what does that mean? It has citations from actual research, that's helpful. But then the other aspect is a book that is so prescriptive that it's presenting itself as the only way to do something is a problem, because there are a lot of ways to accomplish the same thing as parents, right? There's a reason that there are so many different names for sort of trendy parenting, whether we call it gentle parenting or positive parenting or, whatever animal parenting.
Cream-free parenting.
Exactly. Right. So each of these will have their own sort of leaders that espouse this, label. But ultimately, if it is so prescriptive that it says like, do this, don't do that, say this, don't say that, that's going to be challenging for a lot of parents, right? And I think if it doesn't address how we as parents bring ourselves into the equation, that's going to be missing the boat for a lot of people. So unless you happen to be somebody who is very easygoing, rarely triggered by your child's behavior, and is just, stress-free and moving through life without a care, in which case, please call me and tell me how you've done it. It's not likely that any solution for you is going to include only your child, right?
Right.
So I think for me, no matter what we're looking at, we always come back to some key components, which are curiosity, compassion. Those are keys, right? So when we get curious about why our child is behaving a certain way, when we are curious why we're reacting a certain way, when we give our child compassion for the fact that they're struggling with their emotions, or give ourselves compassion, when we have some of those keys, then it almost doesn't matter how we do it, as long as it's guided from that way. So choosing a parenting book, there's many that are great and wonderful. And there will continue to be more that are out there that are great and wonderful. But really, those are the things I would think about. Like, is it grounded in science? And is it at least presenting the fact that there is a parental component to it, not because you're doing anything wrong as a parent, but because you're human and you are parented. And so therefore you have your own struggles and challenges. So having that piece in it. And if it's not structured with compassion, I would put it down.
Put it aside.
Personally. Yes.
I said to a friend with children long after I did, and I shouldn't say long after, but my kids were older. So, and they were saying how people are saying, oh, we always have these things like, oh, my child will never use a pacifier, or my child will never do this. And then we become actual parents. And I remember that morning at 3 a.m. where I was digging through the closet, like somebody gave me a pacifier. Where is it?
Right.
But I said as a person, I do think it's true, is you may have ideas on how you're going to deliver your values as a parent. And you will deliver your values as a parent. It just might not be in the exact way you think. So you might not have a child who can go without a pacifier. I had one that couldn't survive without it, and another that was like, what is this thing you keep putting in my mouth? I do not need this. And so, and I say that because I only birthed 2 of my children. 3 were adopted later. So I only had 2 with pacifiers. Yep. But, these ideas that we create, we have to be flexible as parents. That's something I learned, and it was a very difficult lesson to learn. Yeah. But particularly when I found myself raising children I didn't raise because they were a little bit older. So I missed those initial years, and for them, they were very traumatic. So, again, there's that whole other component, but it forced me to become much more flexible in how I was parenting. And having to look at those, positive parenting, I'm using air quotes that no one can see, or whatever philosophies, because my husband and I recognized that we needed our just philosophies of parenting weren't enough. We did need something a little more structured, and not structured, as you said, as in like being prescriptive. You must say this when this happens, but more a better understanding of how children, in our case, children with trauma, but in general, children develop and what they're capable of at different times, so we could apply it to everybody so that no one was being parented completely different. You know, the outcomes are different because all of them are different.
Of course.
You know?
Yes.
And actually, that's a great segue into talking a little bit more about neurodiversity and how that fits into all of this, because that was, you know, we do have neurodiverse children, and you know, some of it was, we don't know. Was it from the trauma? Was it from birth? Was it both? I don't know the answer to that. But that was part of what we were struggling with in finding better ways to consistently parent. I think that's what we were really looking for, was to be more consistent, and we needed more of a structure. And so we learned a lot more about all of these concepts that you're speaking about. And it really was life-changing. I mean, it was drastically different. And we have 5 children, only 2 of whom we birth, or I birth, let's be honest. I'm not a we were pregnant kind of person.
Nor am I.
But we have 5 very different children. They're all very different in their own ways. And finding a way to parent them that allowed them to, as you said, feel safe, have consistency, feel seen and heard, all of those pieces, and being fair. And fair isn't always equal, you know, but fair is being consistent to me. That's how I look at it. So how does neurodiversity fit into this?
Yes, I'm glad you made that segue. And the reality is that many parents of neurodivergent kids find that the common parenting strategies out there just don't work for them. And it's incredibly frustrating, because when you keep being told that you just need to put your child in timeout, or you just need to take away the iPad, or whatever it might be, and then you're like, okay,
anything that starts
come to my house and try that.
To. Right. Yeah, exactly. You just need to. Great. You want to take them for a weekend? I'd be thrilled.
You just need to come to my house and show me how that would work.
Exactly.
Yes. And so, but what I have found, at least in my experience, is that the strategies that work for neurodivergent children work for all children. And so the reason that is true is because when we understand that kids can be wired differently, that we're all wired differently, and that these differences certainly have their challenges and their strengths, but they're rooted in a set of needs. And if we're not able to identify those needs, we're not going to be able to parent effectively. So a small example that I sometimes give is a family that came to me because they were just viewing their child's behavior as just annoying. This child is annoying. And trust me, my kids are annoying sometimes.
Yeah,
it's not that kids aren't
it's a real
annoying.
thing. The struggle is real.
It's a thing. The struggle is real. But they were saying things like, at the dinner table, he's constantly banging his feet on the chairs, is driving everybody nuts. And we try to tell him to stop. And then we start counting. And then when we get to 3, we're not sure what to do. So we send him away from the table. And then everyone's upset and he doesn't finish his food. And it's a whole big mess. And while they're mired in this reward, consequence, punishment, what do we do, struggle, no one's thinking about, why is this child banging their feet against the chair over and over again, right? And so when I can help parents shift into that detective role, that's when I feel really good about our work. When they can start to say, I wonder what this behavior is trying to communicate, or what function this behavior is serving for them. And if, for example, this child is getting some sensory input, so what we might call proprioceptive input, which is basically giving the brain information about where our body is in space and sending information through our joints and muscles, that might help them calm and regulate. And so when we know that, we recognize that we could give all the threats and punishments in the world, but if we're not actually tuning into what their body is trying to do in that moment, we're not going to solve the problem. Or we might temporarily, but at the expense of something else, right? That behavior is going to come out some other way. It's going to impact our relationship. In some way, it's still going to be a problem.
Do you think there's a natural default to there is no function? Right. There's a natural default to that they're just trying to get attention. They're just annoying.
That's right.
And they're just
trying to manipulate me, or they're trying to whatever. Yes.
Exactly.
Yes. And, instead, when we start to think about, okay, so what possible function does this serve? And that solution was as simple as taking one of those exercise elastic bands and wrapping it around the base of the legs of the chair so the child can bounce their foot up against the elastic. So now it's respecting the fact that people are, annoyed by that repetitive noise of hitting the chair. I'm somebody who gets very easily disturbed by repetitive noise too. So we do respect the other's need as well, but the child's still getting what they need, which is that sensory input. And now nobody's being threatened. Nobody has to leave the table. And we've actually solved the real problem. And so when we think about those things as parents and parenting neurodivergent children, we may be thinking about their sensory processing, right? So basically how they take in information from the world through their various senses. So their sense of smell, their sight, their hearing, their tactile sense, what they feel, but also this vestibular and proprioception, meaning where their bodies are in space and how they're feeling kind of grounded. And so using those strategies to help support regulation is critical. And it works for pretty much all children, neurodivergent or not, as long as we're tuning into what they need. So I can give an example from my children. When my child was younger and we would try to get her to go brush her teeth, rarely does any child want to go brush their teeth, but she's somebody who really was seeking a lot of that deep pressure that comes from that sensory input. And so I found that if I would do wheelbarrow walks with her, so her hands would be on the ground, I'm holding her legs and I'm walking her to the bathroom, her body's getting all of that input that it needs. She finds it fun. And then we're getting to teeth brushing and all as well. And so again, it's about how do we incorporate what their brains and bodies need in order to get things done. And yes, I know that we can't make everything a game and not everything is going to be a wheelbarrow walk. But at the same time, as much as parents push back against that sometimes and say, well, I can't do that all the time, they also are neglecting to think about how much time and energy they're spending in these power struggles to get the teeth brushing, when I promise you that a wheelbarrow walk is much faster than the 10-minute negotiation that happens.
And probably more successful as well.
And always more accessible. Yes.
Yeah. When you're talking about children understanding their bodies in space, what about the children who just don't have any concept of their body in space? I had one of those. It was just no concept. How do you bring them in? Because that isn't serving maybe I don't know what it's serving, but I definitely had a child who was like just a bull in a china shop. I mean, no concept of their size at all. What's an example of something that would be useful or helpful for that?
Yeah. So, I have learned a lot over the years from colleagues who are occupational therapists, especially those who specialize in sensory processing. And so I really appreciate my OT colleagues and have really used a lot of those strategies, because early childhood psychology and occupational therapy is just such an immense overlap.
Yes,
because we really can't teach regulation without these sensory strategies. So for kids who may have zero awareness of what their bodies need, that becomes sort of our work, or maybe an occupational therapy consultation, but also a little trial and error, because the things that we're recommending, these are not, harmful things. They're trial and error. Does this work? Does it not work? So, again, if your child is the one who's sort of bouncing off the walls, you can start using what they call heavy work, right? Which would be things that really activate those muscles. So you might engage in a game where you're sitting down feet to feet and arm to arm, and you're sort of pulling each other back and forth. And that's giving them a lot of sort of deep pressure, or rolling them up in the blanket like a burrito and sort of rolling them around and that tight squeeze, or asking whether deep pressure hugs or really deep kind of bear hugs or massages are helpful. So again, it's a lot of experimentation. So you don't have to know for sure what's going to be helpful. You can experiment and see, oh, if we try that, that seemed to work, right? A trampoline or kicking a soccer ball outside, that seemed to actually help calm them. And again, for people needing help, there are occupational therapists who are great at doing this. There's a lot of books about sensory strategies as well. But it doesn't hurt to try these strategies and just see what helps your child and ask them, does that feel good? Does this not feel good? Right? Just like if we go for a massage, if we're lucky enough to go for a massage, massage therapist is going to say, do you like this pressure? Do you like it more or less? And that's how we figure it out, right? By doing and trying.
Yeah. Now, I'm so glad you mentioned that about occupational therapists, because it is so true. And I wasn't actually consciously going there, but I'm so glad you brought it up, because it really is, there's so much overlap. There really is. And, it's funny because when I sometimes say, or there's a recommendation for a child to have an OT evaluation or something like that, and the parents are like, well, their handwriting's fine. It's like, no, that's not.
Right.
That's not really the issue right now.
Yeah.
The least of our concerns.
Exactly.
We've covered so much. And I think the only thing I wanted to touch on was, I know you did a lot of work with early childhood mental health. And I didn't know if there was, that impact, which I think is the outcome, is sort of, we talked about a little bit about that's how part of the shift happened. But what sort of, are you seeing a shift in trends with children and the mental health component?
Yes. Certainly. I mean, I think when I started working in early childhood mental health, it was in Los Angeles, and it was with very vulnerable populations. Many of the children had experienced trauma in early years. I worked with many in foster placements or, with caregivers and non-biological caregivers. And it is such, first of all, it's a privilege to work with these families and to help them sort of figure out what works. But definitely there is this recognition that children are learning from, the very, very beginning,
right,
and that what we do matters. And one of the things that delighted me the most when I worked in LA and working with this project called Project ABC, which stood for About Building Connections. And it was being able to work with some moms who had no experience of attachment and loving care as children themselves, right, suddenly be able to shift how they viewed themselves as a parent, viewing themselves as competent parents, and being able to connect with their child. And when I would see the delight on the parent's face being with their child, I knew I was onto something, because parents understandably often come to us feeling very frustrated, very helpless, and often sort of viewing their child in a very negative light. And when we can start to shine a spotlight on what's working in their relationship and see that develop and grow, and watch them enjoy being in each other's company again, that is magical to me. And so I think as a profession, we're seeing more and more of that, but also understanding the importance of maternal mental health as well. And as we see that and talk about that more, because I think so many, I'll speak, about women in particular who often, bear the emotional load disproportionately, at least in sort of cisgender heterosexual relationships. We're seeing just this mental and emotional load on women and mothers, and also expecting them to parent by these certain standards and saying these things all the time, and also be a great role model, and also work, and also do this.
Yep.
And until we start to recognize that we need to pull all of that back and get back to just good enough parenting, being good enough parenting, and allowing ourselves to just be in connection without the voices of, 50 experts telling us, no, we're doing it wrong. Coming back to those instincts that we are, generally wired for our connection. And if we haven't had those experiences, being able to, again, extend ourselves compassion that we didn't learn that or we didn't get that, and then figure out how we can bring that now to our relationship with our child. So I do think that we're shifting in a very positive direction, but I still think we have a long way to go too.
Yes. And as a foster parent, I've seen that, and it is really beautiful when parents are able to turn it around. And, I've had children in our house that came from a not so good situation and were able to go back, and that was because, and it's almost always the mom, that a lot of times dad isn't even around. I hate to, it's just a fact, but a lot of time, mom being able to self-reflect and look at it and watch them turn it around. And an interesting shift as well, which is that through DCF, is back in the day, their goal was to remove children from bad environments and get them adopted or in other homes that were better, quote unquote, again, with my non-visible air quotes, get them into environments that were better and keep them there. And what they've learned over time is it doesn't matter what mom and dad did. It's still mom and dad. And at some core level, they still love them and want them, and that children do better if we can get them back in their lives in a healthy way.
Yes.
And it's, and I went through that too, with just because my home is better, again, with the non-visible air quotes, doesn't mean their home isn't what they need.
Yeah.
They just need to be safe, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And, and we can get really judgy on that. So,
100%. Yeah. And it's very interesting. There was some research where, I think it was in Florida, where they were doing some sort of experimental real paradigm shifts in terms of how they were managing kids who came into non-biological parent care or foster care. And they were sort of fostering a whole family with a family as opposed to removing a child. Yes. And that was remarkable to see what happens when you don't just remove the child and then create a potential trauma from the separation of the attachment alone, and put them where the caregiver is also having that reparenting experience. And of course, that's not always the case in cases, but it just speaks to the fact that when that's possible and when we can help support the parent to get that reparenting experience themselves, we can heal multiple generations at a time.
And wouldn't that be wonderful if we could do that for everybody?
Yes, that would be lovely. Yes.
This has been so helpful, I have to say. And I feel like, you took a lot of not so intuitive information that made it really understandable. So I really appreciate that. And I love what you said about looking for parenting books. The way you articulated that is it grounded in science? I mean, not that someone's experience isn't worth knowing, but is it grounded in science, and how prescriptive is it? Because that is true. When you think you're trying to follow a script while parenting, that is really difficult. You've got enough going on in your brain. And we were able to find some books that were really great that gave us information about child's development. And then here are some examples of how you might handle these situations.
Exactly.
Here are some different ways. And it's an ongoing thing. And I think as parents, if we're willing to self-reflect, we're not perfect parents. We're not perfect at anything we do. There are a few exceptions out there that are perfect at a few things, and God love them. But, I think it's always, when I go back to that person saying, I don't need parenting skills or parenting books, it's not about needing parenting books. It's about how well educated you want to be about the most important job you have.
Yes. Well said. Yes. So we're all perfectly imperfect, and that's all our children need from us anyway. And that allows them to be perfectly imperfect too.
Exactly. So when someone is listening to this and they say, I need to find Dr. Tamara Soles, how are they going to find you?
So my website is a great first stop. So my website is drtamarasoles.com. So drtamarasoles.com. And I have free resources on there, a lot of blog posts on various topics, as well as my courses and my No More Power Struggles courses there too. Or on social media, I'm on Instagram most, or LinkedIn. depending on their interests. So
wonderful. And I'm going to have all that information in my show notes. So anyone
Thank
who's
you.
driving or you're out for a run, you don't have time to write this down, they're in the show notes. So please just go back to where you found the podcast, and you should find them there. Also, just to be more specific, I know you have a free PDF called The 4 Hidden Reasons Your Child is Melting Down, which are quite helpful. So go look that up. And thank you so much again for joining me. This was really, really helpful episode that I know my audience is going to get a lot out of.
Well, thank you for having me. And I appreciate the advocacy and information that you share in the world as well. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining me today. Please don't forget to follow this podcast so you don't miss any new episodes, and leave a review when you have a chance. If there's anything you want to hear about or comment on, please go to my Facebook page, Special Ed on Special Ed, and find me there. I'll see you next time here on Special Ed on Special Ed. Have a fabulous day. The views expressed in this episode are those of the speakers at the time of the recording and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any other agency, organization, employer, or company, or even that individual today.